Uh, yes. All right. So thank you all for being here. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And I love that we're all here together to discuss comradeship and to practice comradeship in action, hopefully. And I was thinking about what I think Ben posted on social media saying that you can come get a big Zoom hug from your comrades at this event. And I love that so much. So I hope we can all just like give each other a big Zoom hug through this discussion. And if you come away from this event feeling like you have had a Zoom hug, then I feel like that's a great success. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. See if I can do this. Okay. No, really? Okay. Come on. Oh no. I thought this
Is it letting you?
It's giving me like weird security and privacy settings. Uh-oh. Can I share it? Maybe I should share it with
Okay, try now.
Oh, really? Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can do it again. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. Okay. Oh, I don't want to open system preferences. Okay, I have an idea. Why don't I, can I share it with you, Kendall? And
yeah.
Okay.
You give me the link, I can.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to send it to you. And then, okay. So I just sent it to you.
Did you send it to me via Zoom or?
I shared it with you, so you should have gotten a.
Did I get an email?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's fine. Just let me get into my email.
Do you know how to mute my?
Okay, I have it. Let me just hit the present button after it loads.
Exactly, Colin. It's a hug deferred right now. So you can, Kendall, can you be like my forward clicker person if this works? Yay, awesome. Really awesome.
I think it's Steve's mic is giving some sort of feedback.
Here, you should be able to mute people.
Oh, I should be able to mute people?
Yes, please. Someone can.
I'm not sure how to.
Okay, I did it.
Okay, yay. Okay, great. So, can you forward to the next slide? So the theory of the comrade that we're talking about is based on a book by Jodi Dean called Comrade, an Essay on Political Belonging, which was published by Verso in 2019. Go ahead, Kendall. Jodi Dean is a political theorist and professor of political science, and she's also a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So she comes from a different tradition than we come from slightly, but that doesn't mean that she doesn't have valuable ideas to offer still. Next slide. Steve, can you mute, please? Thank you. So the etymology of the word comrade was first used in the 16th century to describe someone who shares a room with another. In Spanish, camarada is someone who is so close to another man that he eats and sleeps in the same house with him. It comes from the Latin word camera, meaning a room, vault, or chamber. A chamber is a room, a room is a repeated structure that takes its form by producing supported cover for those underneath it. Sharing a room, sharing a space generates a closeness, an intensity of feeling, and expectation of solidarity that differentiates those on one side from those on the other. Comradeship is a political relation of supported cover. Next slide. So what is a comrade? For Jodi Dean, a comrade is a mode of address, so to address one another as comrade, a carrier of expectations, i.e. what we expect from one another as comrades, and a figure of belonging in the communist and social traditions. The comrade is a generic figure for a political relation between those on the same side of a political struggle. Comrades are those who tie themselves together instrumentally for a common purpose. If we want to win, we must act together. Comrades are those on the same side of political struggles, or they're those that you can count on, and they're in it for the long fight. They're acting voluntarily, though not always of their own choosing. They are able to rely on each other, even when they don't like one another, or even when they disagree with each other, and they are accountable to one another. And then Jodi Dean talks a lot about comrades in the context of parties, which doesn't just connote political parties, but any kind of, a political home in a sense. She says some reject parties as authoritarian, as outmoded, as ill-fitting a society of networks. This rejection of the party as a form for left politics is a mistake. It ignores the effects of association on those engaged in common struggle. It fails to learn from the everyday experiences of generations of activists, organizers, and revolutionaries. Rejection of the party form has been left dogmatism for the last 30 years and has gotten us nowhere. So Jodi Dean's obviously a big fan of the party. And she draws a lot on the ideas from the Communist Party in the US to illustrate a lot of the ideas about comradeship, but she importantly notes that a lot of those ideas could be applied anywhere that political engagement happens on the same side of a struggle. Next slide. So comradeship redefines work. The comrade relation remakes the place from which one sees, what it is possible to see, and what possibilities appear. It enables the reevaluation of work and time, what one does and for whom one does it. Is one's work done for people or for the bosses? Is it voluntary or done because one has to work? Does one work for personal provisions or for the collective good? One wants to do political work. You don't want to let down your comrades. You see the value of your work through their eyes, your new collective eyes. Work determined by markets, work determined not by markets, but by shared commitments becomes fulfilling. And then next slide. Comradeship also reclaims our sense of common time. Bernard Asp sees the problem of capitalism as a problem of the loss of common time. We lose our sense of time as shared enjoyment and collective being together, like getting a Zoom hug. From holidays to meals to breaks, whatever common tie we have is synchronized and enclosed in forms of capitalist appropriation. In contrast, comradeship allows us to break from capitalism's 24/7 injunctions to produce and consume for the bosses and owners. Comradeship is egalitarian and horizontal. The figure of the comrade disrupts capitalist society's hierarchical identifications of sex, race, and class. It insists on the equalizing sameness of those on the same side of political struggle and renders that equalizing sameness productive of new modes of work and belonging. And Jodi Dean talks a lot about comrades the figure of the comrade as a utopian figure, but she's using it in a very particular sense, in the sense that Kathy Weeks writes about. So Kathy Weeks says one function is to alter her notion of a utopian longings. One function is to alter our connection to the present, while the other is to shift our relationship to the future. One is productive of estrangement, the other of hope. The power of the comrade is in how it negates old relations and promises new ones. The promise itself ushers them in, welcoming the new comrade into relations irreducible in their broader setting. And Jodi Dean has a concept of survivors and systems. She says about survivors on one end of the spectrum that late capitalism reduces us to survivors, those with nothing left to cling to but their identities, often identities forged through struggle and attached to the pain and trauma of these struggles. And then on the other end of the spectrum are systems, which are post-humanist concerns with geology, extinction, algorithms, hyperobjects, biosystems, planetary exhaustion, operating on a scale so vast, so complex that we can scarcely conceive of them, let alone affect them. So comradeship is an alternative to both of these preoccupations and to the neoliberal attachments to identity and allyship associated with them. Neoliberalism displaces politics, emphasizing individualized self-cultivation, self-management, self-reliance, self-absorption. Neoliberalism's displacement of politics manifests in the opposition between survivors and systems. The former struggles to persist in conditions of unlivability rather than try to seize and transform these conditions. The latter are systems and objects determining us, things to view and diagram and predict and perhaps mourn, but not to affect. The fight to survive is the key feature of an identity imagined as dignified and heroic because it has to produce itself by itself. And alongside that comes the concept of allyship in contrast to our concept of comradeship. So allyship is based on identity. It includes and excludes on that basis of identity. It's a solitary process. You'll often hear people say, that, you know, it's not my job to educate you. You need to go figure it out for yourself. Go Google it. Like, if you don't know, that's not my burden to figure it out for you. So it's a very solitary process. It's usually didactic and instructional. It focuses on these sort of how-tos and do's and don'ts, like a mini lifestyle manual with techniques for navigating the neoliberal environment of privilege and oppression. So what to say and not to say as an ally, how to be a good ally, etc. Emphasizes changing oneself rather than the world. And it requires no political framework. And most importantly, it's compatible with capitalism. It doesn't challenge systems of oppression, but rather offers primers for how to skillfully navigate privilege and oppression while the underlying systems remain unchanged. And in that way, allyship falls short. Allyship is a disposition, a confrontation, not with the state or capitalist power, but with one's own discomfort. To become an ally is to work to cultivate in oneself proper habits of listening, to decenter oneself, to the aside, and become aware of the lives and experiences of others. It's an interior act, an act of the self on the self. One's politics may be entirely in one's head. The process of educating oneself is isolating, individuating. Learning is modeled as consuming information, not as discussion, coming to a common understanding or studying the text and documents of a political tradition. It's up to the individual to figure it out on their own. So it's in contrast to what we're doing at this very moment right now, where we are engaging in discussion together on a topic and exploring it and learning alongside one another. We need to relearn how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. I've got an image of a sort of social media warrior there, tapping away, doing that work of capital for it. Where the ally is hierarchical, specific, and acquiescent, the comrade is egalitarian, generic, and utopian. The egalitarian and generic dimensions of the comrade are what make it utopian, what enable the relation between comrades to cut through the determinations of the everyday, which is another way of saying capitalist social relations. And then Jodi Dean talks quite a bit about the idea of the comrade as a generic concept. Comrades don't connote a race or ethnicity. They're gender neutral. The comrade is necessarily plural. It's more about the other than the self. Comradeship requires the dissolution of attachments to self-sufficiency, hierarchy, and individual uniqueness. The figure of the comrade operates as an ego ideal, the perspective comrades take when they see themselves acting politically. So in that sense of it being a figure, it's almost symbolic in that we see ourselves in the figure of the comrade. Comradeship demands the elimination of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and all forms of oppression intrinsic to capitalism. Comradeship provides a brief respite from these forms of oppression. Comradeship must be practiced not just in party work, but in everyday life. And then this is a very poignant quote from Frank Walderson talking about being in the Soviet Union in the 70s and having a Russian man come up to him and take his hand and hold his hand. He says, "I had had an urge to say, I'm a linebacker, I'm not a homosexual. Then I looked into the man's eyes and realized that this was not a come on. It was simply a profound gesture of camaraderie. And I wanted to weep. For at that moment, as that man who was willing to weave his few words of English into my few words of Russian, and I ascended the stairs to the cinema, I thought of the wretched children at Kenwood Grammar School who 11 years before had chosen to hold up recess until hell froze over rather than form a line where one of them would have to hold my hand. If communism will cleanse my hands, I had thought, then I am a communist." Comrades were those not only courageous enough to practice a mode of belonging deeply at odds with the prevailing culture, but dedicated enough to recognize how personal relations help produce political power. Comradeship often arises when there's nothing left to lose. So Jodi Dean talks quite a bit about the ways in which comradeship arises out of moments of desperation and extreme destitution, abject poverty. It's from the position of this communist future that the destitution of the remaindered others manifests as comradeship. From the perspective of communism, desolation isn't the end. It's an opening to something we couldn't grasp before, the presence of the thing that exists when all is lost, comradeship. The comrade is the zero level of communism because it designates the relation between those on the same side of the struggle to produce free, just, and equal social relations, relations without exploitation. Their relation is political, divisive, and it is intimate, intertwined with the sense of how desperately each depends upon the other, if all are to persevere. And then Jodi Dean's got 4 theses on the comrade, which we'll briefly touch on each one. Her first thesis is that comrade names a relation characterized by sameness, equality, and solidarity. For communists, this sameness, equality, and solidarity is utopian, cutting through the determinations of capitalist society. Comrade relations are relations of a new type, relations that disrupt the confines of the family, heteropatriarchy, and binary gender. Comrades are those on the same side of a struggle for an emancipated, egalitarian world. The second thesis is that anyone, but not everyone, can be a comrade. So the image on this slide is from Ernest Lubitsch's Ninochka. And there's a scene in the film where these comrades are looking for a fellow comrade in Paris, and they don't know who he is or what he looks like. And he could literally be anyone. And so they're watching all these people on the train platform thinking, is that a comrade? Is that a comrade? And then they see one guy who like puts up his arm like Heil Hitler. And they're like, okay, that's definitely not a comrade. And then Greta Garbo's character comes and introduces herself, and they make a big deal out of the fact that she's a woman. And she says, you know, don't let my womanhood get in the way. Like I'm a comrade just like you. So it illustrates the point. Jodi Dean, by bringing up that film scene, is making the point that anyone could be a comrade, but not everyone can be a comrade. So identity has nothing to do with comradeship. Rather, it's about work, the work of building socialism. Comradeship is collective, not individual. Comradeship is not localized. So like in this instance right now, we're interacting with each other from all over different places geographically. Some of us have never met in person, and yet we are still comrades. Comradeship is not based on kinship. It's not mediated by the passing on of privilege or property, which is how the state is invested in the project of kinship. And nor is it based on the familial imaginary. Families are stuck with each other, but comrades need each other. Different than relations between neighbors, lovers, colleagues, citizens, or friends, none of which are intrinsically political relationships. So we may have comrades who are neighbors or lovers or colleagues or fellow citizens or friends, but they're necessarily separate. And as comrades, we have to separate out those different kinds of relationships, because the relationship between comrades is a unique kind of relationship that doesn't exist anywhere else in our society. All of these other relations, such as neighbors, lovers, etc., tend to manifest when comradeship degenerates, when comradeship bleeds into the specific, i.e. race, ethnicity, nationality, sex, etc. It is equated with relations mediated by the state, and the cut of the generic is lost. So you kind of get a sense of what Dean is trying to say with the concept of the comrade as generic. The third thesis is that the individual as a locus of identity is the other of the comrade. Comrade denotes a sameness as those on the same side. Comrade as a mode of address negates specificity, titles, and identities inscribed with differentiation and hierarchy. Because not everyone is a comrade, calling someone a comrade marks a divide, meaning, are you with us or not? Comrades are different than militants. The former is multiple, replaceable, fungible, while the latter is a single figure fighting for a cause. Militancy is about political intensity, while comradeship is about political relationality. Comrades share the intimacy of common work, such as preparing newsletters, making banners, planning actions, or joining a Zoom meeting. Thesis 4 is the relation between comrades is mediated by fidelity to truth. Practices of comradeship materialize this fidelity, building its truth into the world. So Dean talks about truth as a process, and she says that collectivity doesn't imply uniformity or blind faith. Comrades demonstrate fidelity through concerted, disciplined engagement, and that fidelity manifests not through belief, but through shared political work. So it's a practical kind of work, not an idealistic belief-based kind of fidelity. And then Dean talks about 4 different characteristics of the comrade. So the concept of discipline, discipline of work and subordinating the individual will to the will of the group. Expectations and the responsibilities to meet them constrain individual action and generate collective capacity. Lenin wrote often of the need for discipline. The working class demonstrates through proletarian discipline that capitalists and landlords are superfluous. We don't need them. We can and will do it ourselves. Discipline itself is revolutionary. Lenin said it is a victory over our own conservatism, indiscipline, petty bourgeois egoism, a victory over the habits left as a heritage to the worker and peasant by accursed capitalism. The second characteristic is joy. The joy of discipline is internal and external, felt by comrades and experienced by those who witness how discipline changes the world. Through the intense collectivity that discipline enables, comrades can do the impossible. They are liberated from prior expectations and constraints. Joy accompanies a sense of collective invincibility. Together we made it happen, and we did it for purposes larger than ourselves. Thirdly, enthusiasm. Comrades do their work with enthusiasm. As Lenin said, one must be enthusiastic to accomplish great things. We get a surplus of energy from engaging in work that is collective, accomplishing more than we ever could alone. Enthusiasm is the surplus that collective discipline generates. And lastly, courage. The courage of the comrade is not an individual virtue, and it's an effect of discipline, the strength that arises as a result of self-denial in the service of common struggle. Comradely courage means the capacity for self-criticism and to admit when one is wrong. It also takes great courage, and this is my thought more than Dean's, but I think it takes great courage to practice camaraderie in opposition to capitalist social relations, and to practice a way of relating to one another that we have little practice with in our everyday lives. Comradeship is not something that we are taught under capitalism. So it takes great courage to figure out how to chart the unknown in that way. And then Dean talks about the end of comradeship. When does comradeship end? She brings up, and this was in one of the articles that was part of the reading for this week, the trial, the 1931 trial of August Jokinen, as sort of a case study in how expulsion works. In the early 1930s, Jokinen and several other white comrades, he was a Finnish immigrant, went to a club, and several Black comrades tried to enter the club, and they were turned away. And these comrades, who were part of the same Communist Party, they didn't do anything. And Jokinen was put on trial for basically just for not standing up for his Black comrades and defending them. And they agreed, everybody agreed that he was guilty. That wasn't the subject of the trial so much. He admitted his own guilt, but the subject of the trial was more, what do you do with a comrade who is guilty of a transgression? Do you expel them? When do you expel them? What are the grounds for expulsion? Do you give them a way back into the party? And basically they gave him a 6 to 12 month period of time where he was expelled from the party, but he had a path back to the party, importantly. And he had measures that he could take to rectify some of the internalized racism that he had sort of absorbed through being within capitalist society. And that actually became such a strong commitment in him to want to find his way back to the party and to rectify the mistakes that he had made, that he was actually deported for it directly because of his devotion to the party. So he was deported back to Finland. But it really brings up the questions around when do we allow people inside that chamber or that vault, so to speak, of comradeship, and when is it a line too far to cross, and how do we bring people back in when they've made mistakes? And then obviously resignation is another thing, when your politics no longer align with that of the party. And that Dean talks about how that actually can be clarifying. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if you realize that this party no longer serves you, then that could be a clarifying process within class struggle. And then drift, when I think that one's pretty self-evident, when people drift away from the party. And then she talked lastly about the end of the world, not in the sense of the world actually ending, but in the sense of comradeship being the end of comradeship being the end of the world. She talks a lot about what happened when the party dissolved, how that affected certain people. And she says the end of comradeship is the end of the world, non-meaning, incoherence, madness, and the pointless, disorienting insistence on the I. And finally, Dean says the mistake here is in thinking, she's talking about when people say, will there still be a need for comrades after the revolution? People approach her with that question a lot. And she says the mistake here is in thinking that communism is the end of history rather than history's condition of possibility, the possibility we need if there is to be anything like history in the future. The problems facing the world can only be addressed through communism as comrades. The class struggle today is the fight for the future. Capitalism is incapable of addressing climate change and the migrations and struggles over resources that will result with anything other than militarism, walls, and genocide. At the same time, comradeship is not risk-free. It is not a magical solution to all the problems facing the left, much less the world. But it is the only form through which these problems might be solved. Anything less will doom us to the competition, individualism, cynicism, and melancholia into which we've descended. To be a left at all, we have to be comrades. So I'll kick it back to y'all to discuss some of the many questions that this brings up. Differences between comradeship and allyship. What do we do when a comrade makes a mistake? I think there's lots to discuss, so I'll kick it back to y'all.